I made a video on Powercreep and HSR, so let's actually talk about it in Genshin Impact. We have a large roster of characters here, from 4 stars to 5 stars, and we're primarily going to be talking about the 5 stars, because I do think those are the individuals people look at the most and say, oh, this is a direct power creep to another character. A new example would be Albedo versus Chiori. First and foremost, Genshin avoided power creep for a very long time and has continued to do so, and primarily this is due to elemental reactions. You can have a character that is previously viewed as bad or not worthwhile become much better with an additional elemental supports, an additional damage boost for that element itself, or additional specific elemental buffers, such as characters like Cognosphere, who buffs electro damage. Alternatively, we've seen that expand with the addition of Dendro as a whole, and elemental reaction buffers. So regardless of circumstance, let's talk about how characters have changed over time. First and foremost, many individuals say that Kazuha power creep Venti, and on one hand, you could understandably think that, but let's legitimately consider the different roles these characters offer. Kazuha is primarily meant to do a slight amount of grouping, but specifically to buff elemental reactions. Many of you aren't really going to be using Kazuha if you need crowd control. Venti is still the king of crowd control, he always has been. Kazuha is solely used in a vast majority of situations to provide you with an elemental infusion within a swirl. That way you can melt with characters like Ganyu, or alternatively just to boost elemental damage. That's usually used with characters like Raiden Shokin or any hyper carry, including Yoimiya and mono elemental teams. So then if we're talking about characters who are power creep, we need to consider the roles they offer. Supports are very difficult to judge if they've been power crept or not because many individuals use supports for multiple roles. For example, you could say that Venti's been power crept by Kazuha, but you don't use them in the same position. If you want crowd control, you go Venti. If you want damage buffing, you go Kazuha. In that same vein, supports like Yaimiko and Fischl, even though they theoretically offer the exact same thing, that being off-field electro damage, both of them have their own use case scenarios. Yaimiko does more damage than Fischl. Fischl, however, is more easy to use and requires no energy to be built around. Fischl is also hotter, but she also has more accessible constellations, and at C6 she becomes a great support for normal attacking DPSs, like Yoimiya. Another previous example was Xingqiu compared to Yelan. Speaking bluntly here, most individuals have their Xingqiu at C6. And so if we're going to compare the 5 star at C0, we need to compare it to the 4 star at C6 or the maximum potential, because the vast majority of you are more inclined to have additional copies of a standard 4 star around the launch of the game than a 5 star. With that being said, Yelan isn't better than Xingqiu. In most situations, Yelan is comparable to Xingqiu, yes, but Xingqiu has a slight amount of healing. He has defensive utility within his skill. He additionally can shred Hydro resistance by himself with his cons. And yes, while the healing isn't something you're building out for, it is still nice to have, especially in circumstances where you're taking damage due to your own elemental reactions or just damage you can't avoid. In many of those situations, you can't pair them with a shielder. In this instance, you can't pair Nilo with Zhongli because it ruins the entire purpose of her kits. Yelan gives a damage bonus, but she has no defensive utility. And for characters like Hu Tao, Yelan is worse than Xingqiu. It's why you typically would pair them together. Yelan only becomes comparable and outright better than Xingqiu with constellations. Her C2 allows her to apply enough Hydro to match him, whereas her C4 allows her to not only deal additional damage but help teammates, specifically ones like Hu Tao, Zhongli, and Farina. And so Yelan is more offensive oriented of Xingqiu. Xingqiu is more defensive oriented. This means that they are comparable, but both have their own use case scenarios. If you're using Yoimiya, you'd ideally would want Yelan because Yelan's arrows track. Xingqiu's do not. But Xingqiu has interruption resistance, which means in many cases you don't need Zhongli as much. These characters aren't power creeps of one another. Yelan isn't outright better than Xingqiu. Instead, they are side grades, and one becomes outright better only with constellations. So then what about the case of Albedo versus the on-banner unit, Chiori? Well, bluntly speaking, there is one aspect that Chiori is better in. She has a signature weapon you can actually get. Albedo doesn't have one because his best in slot or previous signature weapon was Cinnabar Spindle, which was event exclusive, but let's ignore that for now. Albedo's biggest issue was the Solar Isotoma, essentially his skill, which could be destroyed, it could be interrupted, you could not place it due to certain positioning of enemies, and as a result it was kind of iffy to work with. Chiori doesn't have that. Out technically speaking, attacks more often, given that his has a 2-second cooldown. Essentially, does damage once every 2 seconds so long as an enemy is being hit by something. Chiori does damage once every 3.6 seconds, so over time, Albedo will be doing more damage frequently. Albedo also has a higher or a wider range than Chiori herself. But of course, Chiori benefits more with Geo teammates in the party, whereas Albedo can benefit more elemental reactions or just other elements teammates. Now, on the topic of constellations, yes, Chiori has better constellations. And as you've seen now, more recent characters do have better constellations than the standard ones. But at C0, at base value, most if not all units are comparable. Ayaka doesn't power creep Ganyu. Ganyu has melt and freeze. Ayaka essentially only has freeze. Hu Tao isn't a power creep of Yoimiya, neither is Yoimiya a power creep of Hu Tao. One has ease of use, the other one has more complex uses, but has higher damage to compensate for that. And this continues long term. Almost every character released has been comparable to one another, but we haven't exactly seen direct power creep. The best example you could theoretically pick would be Neuvillette and Lenny. These are essentially two relatively recent characters in Fontaine, but Lenny is, in most circumstances, stronger than other Pyro characters. He's a bow character though, so he's competing with Yoimiya. Does he have more range than Yoimiya? Yes. He's charge attack focused though, so Yoimiya has more options to buff herself. You can use Yoimiya alongside a Mika, you can use Yoimiya alongside a Yunjin, as Yunjin buffs normal attacks. You can't exactly do that with Lenny. And he does, if you want to use his best team at least, take your best teammates, that being your Shanling, your Bennett, and your Zhongli. If we're looking at characters like Neuvillette, he's exceptionally easy to use. Yes, that's true. He's a charge attack catalyst user who does a lot of damage and has access to the Marushusei Hunter set. But let's be blunt here. A lot of the ease of use of the Fontaine units comes from the fact that they can build crit more easily thanks to that set. And so we've seen better signature weapons, but are more niche to compensate for the fact that they're so good. Neuvillette is a strong character, but as a Hydra DPS, he's not necessarily contending with anyone directly. Tartaglia is a Hydra DPS, yes, but bluntly speaking, he is meant to be utilized in national comps. He's meant to be utilized with other characters who can use elemental reactions, so he's not competing with Neuvillette in that position. Ayato is in theory competing with that, but Ayato also has, once again, access to different reactions and can at the very least take advantage of other buffs like HP, like a Xiangling. And yes, don't get me wrong, you can use Neuvillette with Xiangling, you can use Xiangling with anybody, but there isn't exactly the same position and same fight for the DPS position that Pyro users are going through with Lenny, with Gaming, with Yoimiya and Hu Tao. And so it's a less example, it is less of an example of power creep and more of an example of that roster of elements expanding. HoYoverse didn't really have a DPS. If we're sorting by DPSs and by elements, HoYoverse had Barbara, your healer, Xingqiu and Yelan, your sub DPSs, Mona, your buffer, Tartaglia and Ayato essentially being used for elemental reaction triggering. You can use Ayato with Beidou, you can use Tartaglia with Beidou, and so on. Nilo is a reaction buffer. Furina is a buffer. Neuvillette is your DPS. He's your main on-field damage dealer. And so as a result, he's not competing with anybody within his same elements. If you're opening that roster up to the entirety of the DPS department, then yeah, you can say he's power crept to some individuals, but then you have to consider everybody doing the exact same thing. Genshin, unlike HSR, is about team comps, it's about reactions. Yes, you can build a character out to be your solo DPS, but that's Eula in a prime example here. And many individuals don't like Eula because she doesn't have access to reactions. And so if you're comparing the raw damage at C0, it is more comparable among the entirety of the roster because everyone has their own buffs. Neuvillette, for instance, can take advantage of Vape, and he can take advantage of something like Electrocharged, but he's less flexible with Dendro-oriented teams. Even though Bloom is good, you would have other, better Bloom teammates. Does Genshin have power creep? To a degree, yes, you can say that. Diluc obviously isn't as good as Hu Tao or Yoimiya. But is it bad? No, not really. You can bluntly and quite literally get by with any of the characters from 1.0. Even characters like Keqing have been brought up closer and higher in the meta thanks to Dendro. And so it's less so about what raw DPS character you have, unless you want to use them as an on-field DPS, and more about what you're doing to build them up, whether that's reactions, whether that's your team composition, whether that's the weapons you give them, and so on. Albedo, for example, was a pretty bad character in most units' eyes, especially when you compare him to the other off-field DPSs. But he's still pretty good, and you can use him. I personally do still. So if you're worried about a previous old DPS being power crept, that's not necessarily an issue. Yes, you're going to have units who may perform better in certain positions. No one is going to buff you like a Furina will. But Furina isn't the best in slot teammate in a lot of positions, unless of course you have her C2. So instead, focus on filling out your elemental roster and getting your team comps ready. Don't focus out on picking up the DPS if they're strong. Don't focus on picking up a unit who doesn't have very much flexibility if you don't have the units already to make that team work. It'd be like picking up a Nilou with no Dendro characters for her to work with. Like you won't even have a Yao Yao. Or picking out a Lenny without any Pyro characters for him to work alongside. Tell me your thoughts down below. Either way, hope to see you next time. I still hate how strong Dendro is, and goodbye.